We are very pleased to be able to introduce our keynote speaker, Mr. John Ralston Saul. Mr. John Ralston Saul is an award-winning philosopher, novelist, and essayist. He obtained his PhD from King's College London and spent a number of years traveling, becoming a prolific and award-winning author. Most recently, he is author of The Comeback and A Fair Country, Telling Truths About Canada. He is a longtime champion of freedom of expression and was the international president of PEN International until October 2015. He is also the co-founder and co-chair of the Institute for Canadian Citizenship. The Institute for Canadian Citizenship is a national nonprofit charity that helps accelerate new citizens' integration into Canadian life through original programs, collaborations, and unique volunteer opportunities. I've had the opportunity to meet Mr. Saul in that capacity as a volunteer for the Institute out in Victoria, where the Institute works with special citizenship ceremonies that enhance, hopefully, that experience for the incoming citizens. The most recent project of the Institute is 6 Degrees, which opens a unique space for dialogue around issues that are of concern to the people in this room. He will be speaking with us today on immigration, inclusion, and citizenship, maintaining our focus, the focus of our conference on learning from the past and a vision for the future. So please join me in welcoming Mr. John Ralston Saul.
Bonjour, c'est un grand plaisir d'être ici avec vous sur les territoires non cédés des Algonquins. Je suis toujours très content qu'aujourd'hui, on ouvre la plupart des événements publics avec cette déclaration, ce genre de déclaration, qui est une politesse et une formalité. Mais vous savez, un des signes d'une civilisation, c'est qu'il y a des protocoles. Et sans des protocoles dans l'espace public, vous n'êtes pas dans une civilisation. Et donc, c'est une admission d'un passé, mais c'est aussi une réalisation d'une idée d'appartenance, de complexité, d'histoire, longue histoire. Et c'est pas avant, il y avait des autochtones ici, c'est que toutes les villes canadiennes, avec peut-être l'exception de Regina, ont été construites là où il y avait les centres de civilisation autochtone. Il n'y a pas une grande originalité dans l'idée de mettre la capitale du Canada ici à Ottawa. Ça fait partie de la mauvaise mémoire coloniale du Canada qui a, et en grande partie c'est la faute des officiels d'Ottawa, qu'on n'arrête pas de dire qu'Ottawa était rien du tout, et qui était choisi par la reine de l'Angleterre. Deux mensonges. C'était pas du tout choisi par la reine Victoria. Et au contraire, Ottawa était toujours un des centres de civilisation autochtone millénaire des plus importants dans ce qui est aujourd'hui le Canada. Et juste quelque part d'ici, sur la rivière Ottawa, il y a quelques îles qui s'appellent avec des noms évidemment coloniaux comme Victoria et Albert, etc. Et il y a une chute, les chutes de Chaudière, qui sont un des lieux spirituels, donc liés à l'idée de citoyenneté, un des lieux spirituels les plus importants au Canada, que tout le monde qui montait du sud, qui montait la rivière, pendant des milliers d'années, jusque le XXe siècle, s'arrêtait aux chutes de Chaudière pour une cérémonie spirituelle dans laquelle on mettait du tabac dans les chutes. Maintenant, on a une idée absolument brillante et coloniale de mettre un mur de condos sur ces îles spirituelles. Et personne ne dit rien. Je ne comprends pas pourquoi les gens ne disent rien sur ce scandale. Je dois dire aussi que j'étais ici hier, j'ai écouté le ministre McCallum et je trouve qu'il a très bien évoqué un peu là où nous sommes et ce qui vient de se passer depuis un an. Mais je voudrais aussi ajouter, j'ai lu vos papiers et hier soir j'ai relu la liste de qui vous êtes. Et j'étais très ému par cette coalition que vous représentez, très ému par le fait que la francophonie et la place de la francophonie dans l'idée des migrations et de citoyenneté joue un rôle très important chez vous. Et d'ailleurs, je crois que Marcel Bérubé, le sous-ministre adjoint de l'Éducation française de Manitoba, est quelque part ici, je crois. J'étais avec lui il n'y a pas longtemps à Winnipeg. Et c'est étonnant de voir qu'est-ce qu'on peut faire avec l'intentionnalité, avec un programme réel. C'est-à-dire que les Franco-Manitobains, ils ne sont pas seuls, se sont réveillés un jour et se sont dit, pourquoi est-ce que nous, on ne reçoit pas des immigrants citoyens? Et donc, ils ont mis en place un programme avec le gouvernement de Manitoba, donc le gouvernement du Canada, pour recevoir les francophones. Et la population, l'idée que la francophonie canadienne, dans l'Ouest par exemple, était surtout catholique, blanc, etc., et très vite commencé à changer comme le reste du Canada. Et subitement, moi j'étais l'autre jour devant une salle comme ça, des enseignants d'école publique en Manitoba, et il y a 50 ans, ça aurait été catholique et blanc. Et à la place, il y avait des Canadiens d'origine Afrique du Nord, Afrique du Centre, Europe centrale, etc., etc. C'était une révolution dans la conception de la francophonie canadienne à l'échelle nationale. Et tout ça mis en place par un programme des francophones, établi par les francophones de Manitoba. Et ça montre en quelle mesure que quand nous sommes clairs et nets dans notre esprit, que ce que nous faisons pas par accident, mais exprès, qu'on peut rapidement changer nos propres communautés pour le bien. And I'm also very moved to see a national organization which says that the North and smaller communities is central to what you're doing. I mean, this is incredibly important. The single greatest weakness, and sometimes I say things in order to see somebody else will put up their hand and say, no, there's something even worse, you know? The single greatest weakness in the structure of this country, both from the point of view of governance and citizenship, is the extent to which this country is imagined and governed from a handful of southern cities. And this includes, quite frankly, the universities, the great universities of Canada, living off hundreds of millions of dollars every year in order to house study institutes on the north of Canada. In any other country, and I mean, I don't mind saying something really negative about my own country. In any other country, this would be called pure colonialism. That the governments of Canada give hundreds of millions of dollars to major southern universities so that they can train people to spend a month on an island in the Arctic and have no relationship with training and being with and supporting the communities of the North. This is part of not understanding Canada as a northern country, 3/4 of it being northern, out of which comes enough of our wealth to make the difference between Canada being a first and a third world country. You remove the wealth that comes from 3/4 of the country in the north. You remove that, we're no longer a G7 country, or G8, or whatever it is these days. And we very carefully avoid putting major study institutes in the north, which would establish the fact that the north exists for the north, as the north, that there is an idea of Canadian citizenship which comes out of the north. We just had a prime minister who spent 10 years going once a year to the Arctic to visit the military to visit commercial institutions, never to visit the people of the North. And so we have to really think seriously. We're the only country in the circumpolar world that does not have a university in the Arctic. And we have every excuse under the sun, and every one of them is false. Made up. There isn't enough money. Not true. There isn't a big enough population. Not true. What would they do up there? Crazy. So there is nothing up there to support young people. So we've now got the University of Northern British Columbia, and we've got North Bay, and we've got, you know, the Lakehead, and we've got, but we do not have that real sort of institutionalization of thinking about this great northern country from a northern point of view. And that's central to the idea of immigration. Where do immigrants go? What is citizenship? How do we imagine citizenship? Of course, cities are really important in Canada, but this sort of idea that citizens of cities belong with citizens of other cities around the world, yeah, up to a point. Cities are also the gathering places of people, which in our case, it's not simply rural outside, it's boreal, it's tundra, et cetera, et cetera. And our cities cannot do that work without we taking the life of the smaller communities and the three-quarters of the country, which is outside of these major cities, seriously. And one other tiny comment, am I allowed one critique of your paperwork? I noticed that in some places you use the word migrant as if it were sort of the royal term above immigrant, refugee, et cetera. And I think some of this, I'm not quite sure, I think some of this comes from international meetings of academics, you could tell me, where of course the dominant language is the European American language. And the Europeans adore the word migrant because that means that they can dream to themselves that everybody who's come is going to leave. That's what the word migrant means. It means you can stay here for a while, but please be clear, you're not going to become a citizen and you're going somewhere else as soon as possible. And in Canada, the word migrant has no dignified meaning. The word immigrant is one of the greatest noble terms in our vocabulary. Canada is built on immigration. And I would really suggest that you remove the word immigrant from all of your paper because it actually prepares, and this is really what I want to talk to you about, it prepares you for the very real and tough conversation which is going on out there. In which, and I know you've heard different things yesterday about numbers and so on, but there is a real debate in the world today, and it's a tough debate. And we are not on the majority side. We're on the cutting edge. We're on a precipice. We're in the experimental zone. And we have to be absolutely clear in our own minds what we're doing well and what we're doing badly, but we have to be prepared from the point of view of the language, the philosophy, the vocabulary, the history. We have to know why we're using certain words. And the moment you start using the word migrant, you have somehow shifted yourself into being colonial fiefdom of the Euro-American argument on, well, I don't know, they're here for the moment. Let's see, you know. So we have to be much, much tougher, much more muscular, much clearer in our intellectual approach to these things. So let me just say that I'm always deeply concerned when I hear people say things like, well, you know, multiculturalism, Pierre Trudeau, 1970s, Immigration Act, 1947. Before that, we were just British subjects. All of these kind of arguments. You know, it's true, there was an Immigration Act. It's true that multiculturalism of a certain sort took form in the 1970s. But these kind of sentences used as a principal explanation put us in denial of the reality of our own experience, good and bad, and our own history. You know, we have had, you know, if saying that you know, we became multicultural in the 1970s is skating over reality, let me slightly skate, but at least it's based in a deep history. And there are all sorts of caveats which if I were writing a 200-page book, I would put the footnotes and caveats in. What we've created here with all the problems, the betrayals, and so on, is nevertheless intentional, not accidental, not the result of colonialism at its best. I mean, what we've done. We have had an intentional immigration policy for half a millennium, for 500 years approximately. It's taken many forms. Some of them have been successes, some of them have been failures, some of them have involved a very close and strong relationship with Indigenous people, others have been evil and wicked. Some have been racist, some have been non-racist. But you have to look at the long historic line. And when you look at the long historic line, which includes the Indigenous people as central players, you realize that there is half a millennium of immigration policy set in Canada, not in Britain, not in France, set here by people here in different ways, formed by people here. And that line has produced, not accidentally, a style, an approach. And that style has some things in common with Brazil and Argentina and Australia and the United States, but it has many things which are not in common. And so, of course, it's very important to know what was in common, good and bad, but it's also very important to know what have we done over that half a millennium, which was interesting, which was the result of geography, of climate, of circumstance, and so on. Because that line of half a millennium, that style, carries with it all sorts of assumptions, which we don't even talk about today. I mean, for example, the idea that, refugees in particular, but immigrants to some extent, will receive some sort of support from public authorities. This goes back 500 years. I mean, when you actually look at the welcoming of Europeans by Indigenous people for 250 years, an extremely long time, 250 to 300 years, depending on which part of the country you're talking about, a very long time of welcoming, of an idea of sharing land as opposed to owning land before it was betrayed in the second half of the 19th century. That was a form of the effective government of Canada in the 16th, 17th, 18th, and early 19th century was Indigenous culture and law and structures. And there was support from Indigenous people for the people who came here from Europe and elsewhere. And that idea of government support, which continued with New France, it continued with the Loyalists, it continued with the enormous waves of what I would call the Sift and Laurier immigrants. That idea, that one idea, that immigration is tied to government support. Secondly, that an immigrant comes to become a citizen. That goes right, but the whole idea of Indigenous people welcoming immigrants into a circle, into the citizenship of the civilization of the First Nations in question. The moment you start saying we got a 1947 Citizenship Act as anything more than a footnote, you're forgetting the fact that we had citizenship ceremonies in the second half of the 19th century for the naturalization of non-British immigrants, right? That there was always this idea that if you were coming to this place, which was really tough, not the place of choice, right? That you had to be drawn into the working of the civilization because we couldn't afford to have people hanging around without a full commitment. So whatever it was called, the idea was we needed immigrants to become citizens as quickly as possible. And thirdly, that this was always tied to volunteerism. Going right back again to the approach taken by Indigenous civilizations, the way in which people were welcomed into the circle. I mean, there's a whole element of volunteerism in helping, the way people were helped. But it's equally true when you look at New France, when you look at the Loyalists, when you look at the Sift and Waves, right up to date. There was always a formal or informal approach towards non-governmental help and support for immigrants. You just take those three things: government support, become a citizen as fast as possible, the central role of volunteerism as a citizen act, an act of citizen engagement. Those three things are central to the characteristic of what makes that half-millennium line of Canada work. We have to get that kind of stuff into our language when we're talking about what we do. Then we can sort of identify where we failed, where we did not rise to our own standards, what the racism meant, where it came from, or the exclusion. You have something to judge it by once you start talking about that. Getting our arguments organized so that we know how to talk to people, our own people, ourselves, but also people elsewhere. We have to understand our history. We have to understand what is essentially a philosophy of citizenship and immigration, even if it's not taught in any of our departments of philosophy. But that's, again, a colonial problem, that departments of philosophy teach European philosophy as if we don't have any ideas here, you know? Except we can do the footnotes on European philosophy, as opposed to saying, hey, we've sort of invented an approach towards immigration and citizenship, which is related to others, but which comes out of this experience, and that is a philosophy of human relationships and the way, you know, of empathy, of the way humans relate to each other. That's the essence of Socrates. That's the essence of Western philosophy, invented in a very different way here, without any references to Socrates, because they were really dealing with the reality of climate and civilization and need. You know, whenever I'm in a conversation, which I very often am, and it's a whole new form of conversation now with 6 degrees, you know, after they sort of start out by saying, well, isn't it wonderful what you're doing in Canada? And then they try to change the subject as quickly as possible. And to talk about the lamentation of their crisis. And then if you insist at all on some possibilities, people will very quickly turn on you, even your best friends, and say, well, you know, Canada's new. And of course, it's so big. And of course, you don't have any borders with any people who are fleeing, and you have a choice, and the implication in the choice is that we automatically choose the best educated and the richest and so on, which to some extent, depending on the time and the policy, we do. Of course, the reality is we're not new. We're not new at all. And I mean, I think you should throw something at any politician who stands up in front of you and uses that old, you know, ridiculous line that this is a new country of opportunity. It's not a new country. I mean, first the Indigenous people, and 500 years of immigration, Indigenous relationships, and immigration, new Canadian, older Canadian, Indigenous relationships. A very long experience. And we are now, and I say this every time I get to my feet, because it's really important to repeat certain things until you suddenly hear somebody repeating it without quoting you, which is a really good sign. When you're being stole from, it means you got it right. We are the oldest continuous democratic federation in the world. The oldest continuous democratic federation in the world. We didn't break up and kill 800,000 of our own citizens, like our neighbors to the south. There is no older democratic federation in the world. And we're, depending on how you do the argument, the second or third oldest continuous democracy in the world. We have an enormously long experience. We didn't have coups d'etats and dictatorships in the 19th century and mass murders in the 20th century. We have all sorts of things we've done wrong, but that is a very important thing to understand. And we're not big. Because again, I saw in the Globe and Mail today, you know, almost all of our immigrants, and it's a flaw, go to 5 cities. And some more go to 10 cities. They don't go to the north. We don't have masses of people heading to the tundra, you know? So in fact, our immigration is going to a population density situation very similar to the one in the United States and Europe. So as soon as somebody says to you, you're a big country, just tell them to get lost. You know, it's wrong. You can't accept those kind of arguments. And third, the idea that, you know, we have a choice and they don't really misses the point. That their geography makes choice impossible. And I just want to do a little step aside here, because we have to understand our situation vis-a-vis their situation, because that's the dominant argument that we're going to be facing for the next, I don't know what, 20, 25 years. So the reality is that for the last 70 years, Europe, not Central Europe, but Western Europe, country by country, has been a major place of immigration. You know, never use the word. You know, it's refugees, or it's migrants, or it's workers, or whatever it is. But it's never immigrants. 70 years of very impressive immigration to Europe. And I give them full credit, because in many cases, it's worked out quite well in spite of a lot of things. But what's wrong is that after 70 years, there isn't a single European country with an immigration policy. I mean, the other day, the vice chancellor of Germany suggested they should have a proper immigration policy since they're taking so many immigrants. And he was immediately shunted into a cupboard, you know? That nobody will talk about what they're actually doing. This is completely dysfunctional. You cannot have civilizations which are doing A and talking as if they're doing B. Because when you do that, you do not put in place the policies which allow you to deal properly and with dignity and with a forward-looking approach to A. And so Europe has created an incredible crisis for itself, which Socrates would not have approved of. You know, the unexamined life is not worth living. Right. Well, they've been living 70 years of an unexamined life when it comes to immigration. And guess what? They're living the outcome today. Because the follow-on to there being no immigration policies in any of those countries is that, sorry, and I just want to say, because if you have a policy and people know what the policy is, then everybody can adjust to the policy. Yes, with programs, but also in their attitudes. You can't have the discussions in a sensible way if you don't have a discussion in a sensible way of what you're actually doing. But the second thing is, as a result, there isn't a single European country, and I stand to be corrected, and I've been corrected twice, and in both cases, I just go to the internet and prove I'm right. So you can correct me too. There isn't a single European country with a minister of immigration. We've had a minister of immigration since it's either 50-something or 67 or 72, I forget the exact date. Been called various things. But, so there are people who have a title, which is Minister of Immigration, and they're junior ministers under the Minister of the Interior, which is to say that all immigration policy in Europe is run by the police. You know, a Minister of the Interior is all about order and fear. That's what, you know, and control. And under that, you have sort of junior ministers who are called Minister of the Interior. But one of the results of that, and of course, since the Twin Towers in New York catastrophe, security forces have got stronger and stronger and stronger, and they've become the dominant discourse in country after country. The result of that is that no matter how hard these nice junior ministers try, their discourse, their organization, their structures are somehow, they begin with an idea of security and fear. That changes radically the idea of what's happening out there and what is it that we can do. But it also means that European countries do not have large professional bureaucracies set up to deal with immigration. Why would they? They don't have an immigration policy, and they don't have an immigration minister. So that what does that mean in practical terms when you come down to things like the crisis at the moment, the Mediterranean crisis? What it means is that if you go to the Canadian Embassy, and I haven't checked in particular because it's done regionally, in the Canadian Embassy in Beirut or Algiers, you know, just to take two small, or Amman, you'll probably find that 50% of the diplomats in the Canadian Embassy actually work for the Department of Immigration. I'm not going to try and use the new terms to name the departments. And these are professionals. And, you know, you could critique that, what they do and how well they do it, but the fact is that these are professionals who've been doing this all their life, whose job is to deal with immigrants and refugees. And you can go with dignity if you're not fleeing for your life. Remember, all the people who get on those boats are not fleeing for their life in the most immediate sense. Many of them are fleeing for their life in a more profound, longer-term sense, coming from sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, and even parts of the Middle East. They can go with dignity to a Canadian embassy somewhere and get themselves on a list and get into a process. Does anybody really believe that a family wants to put their childs into a boat which is likely to sink? That families really want to endanger themselves or even leave their countries if they don't need to? I mean, people want to be treated and need to be treated in a dignified, humane process, which, because of our philosophical structure, which leads to an administrative structure, which leads to an international structure, we're able to do. You can critique it, but we're able to do it more or less. You go to the French embassy in Algiers or whatever, you'll probably find a little group of visa officers, or to deal with people coming to work. There is no process. There's no dignified process. So people, a large number of the people who are choosing to risk their lives could choose to go and become part of a dignified process which might lead to immigration and citizenship if that path existed. And we have to be very clear about that. And I just written a thing for Der Spiegel, and I started saying to my German friends, you wouldn't be in quite the crisis you're in if you had a policy and a minister and a bureaucracy. And it's as if, and I'm not criticizing them in this sense, but for everybody it seems to be an enormous surprise, and it probably is to you, the idea, you just have to think about it in a muscular way, in a different way, and saying whatever the flaws of our policies, we've got one, and whatever you may critique about our department, we've got one, and our civil servants, we've got them. It's a policy. It's a 500-year-old policy, which you can work to improve, but it's still something that you can work with. And it's about dignity and a real kind of choice. And it's not always about us taking the top. And as you know, if you looked at the numbers in the Globe today, that in fact, by taking what will end up being about 60,000 Syrian refugees from the refugee camps in Jordan and Beirut, and I think some in Turkey, we actually were choosing to take the less educated. That the most educated are the people who are getting in the boats because they're coming from families that have enough money to, bribe their way through, which is the horror of what they have to do to buy these places step by step. And even the numbers, Germany has done this incredibly wonderful thing, which I just think is fabulous, of taking a one-time million, which may or may not bring down the current chancellor, but even if she's brought down history, will judge her in a very, very positive way, and her government. But the reality is that million represents 1.2% of the German population. Canada takes 1 million people every 3 to 4 years. Year after year after year after year, decade after decade after decade after decade. And every year it's somewhere between 0.7 and 1% of the population. So it's not a criticism of the gesture, but I'm trying to show the difference between having a conscious policy, which we're not very good at describing, an approach, a method, a history, a philosophy. The idea that immigration leads to citizenship. And I'll put this in the most brutal terms. We have never been interested in having people come here in order to hang around just working hard and making money and looking after their families. Partly because it's such a tough place. We've always said, well, if you're going to be here, you've got to carry some of the responsibilities of making this place work. So we want you to be a citizen as soon as possible. Yes, we had these moments when we excluded, after all, I'm married to a Chinese refugee who came in right at the end of when, the Chinese were excluded, and we did things to the Japanese, and, I know all of that. But the long line is that we have always wanted people who came here to become citizens as soon as possible. And it's a very interesting philosophy, because what it really means is that when you become an immigrant, a landed immigrant here, it's like getting engaged. And within 5 years, 86% of immigrants to Canada become citizens. In the United States, it's about 44%. In Europe, I don't know, it's down around 10% or 9%. And so within 5 years, you get married. And we've been doing this for 500 years, one way and another. That idea, you're here, you're engaged, within 5 years, we want you to be married. And unlike, human marriages to each other, there are many fewer divorces. We've had a Conrad Black incident, and that's about it. I mean, it's... And that's why the public ceremonies are so important. The Institute for Canadian Citizenship, we do about 75 a year. It's not that many, but most people who do community ceremonies do about 1. And our ceremonies last about 3 hours, and we have roundtable discussions on citizenship where people like you come out and chair them and ask the new citizens, well, what do you think after 4 years here or 5 years here? Tell us what your experiences are. What do you think you can change? What would you like to see changed, and so on. That public celebration isn't simply legal. It's a way of saying, just the way a sort of two people marriage is, it's a way of saying, you have the right to expect that we who invited you here, even if you're a refugee, we who invited you here, will publicly pay tribute to you for having made such an important and radical decision in your lives. And the only way to publicly pay tribute to the immigrants and refugees is to have an enormous public ceremony with their family and their friends and their colleagues. It's usually, 50 candidates, about 250 people. And it's an enormously important thing, that public celebration. And usually when I'm chairing a ceremony, or when my wife is, or Charlie Foran, who's the CEO of our institute, is sitting, I see him back there, is chairing a ceremony. Many of us, we always say to the people who already have citizenship, well, why don't you just swear the oath as well? Because maybe if you were born here, you never bothered to do anything like that. And so you haven't had to prove, not that you're loyal, you've never had to prove that you're willing to be an engaged citizen. And even if the oath is, is what it is, and there isn't much in it that's very helpful, except from a legal point of view. Nevertheless, if you explain it, people understand what it really means in terms of becoming an engaged citizen, which is the right kind of citizen. When I talk that way in Europe, there are a couple of countries that have ceremonies. The intellectuals kind of say, well, isn't that rather demeaning? I mean, forcing these people to swear loyalty in public. That's not it at all. That's not what's happening. What's happening, actually, is that the people who are already citizens are sitting in admiration of these people who've made such a courageous and difficult choice to rebuild their lives. So that's all part of the 500 years of intentionality, which begin with the Indigenous idea of welcoming people into the circle. And as some of you know, that Indigenous spatial idea, in my opinion, is really at the heart of Canadian immigration philosophy. Because for 250 years, you weren't asked to recreate yourself miraculously and become a perfect little whatever, which a lot of the Western countries seem to expect people to do, wear clogs now that you're a citizen of the country or something, and completely change yourself. But there was this idea, well, you'll welcome you into the circle because we don't want you dying out there, and now you're in the circle, there's some rules, and let's work out what your role is going to be. It's somewhat chaotic, it's somewhat confusing, and it doesn't demand a complete, erasing of what people were, but it also demands a real participation and finding a way to become involved in the society. It is not passive. It's complex. It's spatial, and it's an Aboriginal idea of community in which there is a real balance between the rights of the individual and the rights of the group, which comes out in our Constitution and in our Charter of Rights, which have a very Indigenous origin to them. And I just want you to be clear in your minds when I keep saying this is old. All of this begins happening at about the time that Luther is nailing his, 95 Theses to the door of the church. About the time of the wars of the 30 Years' War, which is when modern Europe begins to put itself in place, and about the time of the signing of the Westphalian treaties, which is the beginning of the modern European nation state, which is based on the monolithic concept of the nation state, top down, monolithic, one race, one religion, one mythology, whatever else. And that monolithic model is the model which has led to the difficulties they're in today. It led to century after century of murder, of exclusion, of banning of languages. It led to 2 world wars, to Europeans killing 100 million Europeans approximately in 40 years of the 20th century. An incredible victory for civilization. It's called irony, at the very least. Maybe it's sarcasm. Lovely paintings in churches and palaces, 100 million dead in 40 years. I'm terribly sorry. A problem with the philosophy of citizenship and belonging, coming out of the 16th century, exactly the time that we started down a somewhat different road. So I'll give you a quote, which is actually from the 20th century, but which in a sense expresses what Indigenous leaders were saying and communities were saying all along. And it's a wonderful quote from Grand Chief John Kelly from the 1970s to yet another commission coming up from the south to see what are the Indians thinking, i.e. how can we get more of their land. And he said, as the years go by, it's in the middle of a very long and brilliant peace speech. As the years go by, the circle of the Ojibwe gets bigger and bigger. Canadians of all colors and religions are entering the circle. You might feel that you have roots elsewhere, but in reality, you are right here with us. And I can tell you, if you look at the papers of the Royal Commission, the Erasmus Royal Commission, you'll find hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of letters and speeches, etc., by Indigenous philosophical and political and military leaders, which more or less are going down that line. So that's, having that language of being welcomed into the circle is incredibly important, because otherwise you end up using words like migrant and not realizing that you're abandoning a philosophy which has been put in place over a long time here. That idea of government support from Indigenous people through New France, through the Loyalists. Interestingly enough, Loyalists come before the worst of the anti-women movement, the Victorian anti-women movement gets underway. So one of the results is that unmarried women, loyalists, were given 200 acres each. Later, of course, the men got a little smarter and figured out they shouldn't be doing stuff like that. And, so we went through about 100 years of really oppressive behavior towards women. And the Sifton period, which is an astonishing period, we were sometimes bringing in 400,000 immigrants a year. And they weren't from Britain. And they were organized and given, wood, plans for villages, settlement officers who came with them. It's very, very interesting how all of that worked. And the idea, therefore, of naturalization, because they didn't use the word becoming a citizen, because the British subjects got citizenship automatically, but the others had to be naturalized to become Canadian citizens. And all of that was put in place as soon as we started taking in large numbers of people from outside of the British and French areas. So you look at the most important philosophical document in Canada's history, which is the address to the electors of Terrebonne of the first Democratic Prime Minister of Canada, Louis-Hippolyte Lafontaine. He started in 1840 by building an alliance with Anglophone Canada by writing the address to the electors of Terrebonne. The reason none of you read it is because it's not colonial and it's really important. And our schools specialize in teaching only the colonial stuff, not the important stuff. And in the middle of it, he talks about egalitarianism, he talks about public schools, talks about all the things which you will recognize as part of Canada today. In the middle of it, he says, in French, and it was immediately translated to English and was read by everybody, Baldwin's people, he says, Canada is the land of our ancestors. It is our country, as it must be the adopted country of the different peoples who come from around the globe to make their way into these vast forests, very romantic in a sense, to build their homes and place their hopes. Like us, their paramount desire must be the happiness and prosperity of Canada. This is the heritage which they should endeavor to transmit to their descendants. And as the Francophones will know, when he's using the word Canadian in that point, it's a reference to French Canadians. So he's saying, for everybody who always says things about, Quebec and whatever, vis-a-vis new people, he's saying in 1840, les Canadiens are there to welcome people from around the globe. Their children, he says, must be like us, Canadians. And it is very, very interesting that the first democratic government of Canada was elected in the democratic spring of 1848 and unlike the European government, survived the attempted anti-coups and coup d'etats and so on by the family compact and so on. And the first law they passed in March 1848, the very first law passed by a democratic government in Canada 160 whatever years, 68 whatever years ago, was an immigration law. After the disastrous misuse of Canada by the British government and their monarch, dumping, suffering Irish immigrants in Canada. Not that we didn't want them, but they just sent them. Diseased, starving, crippled, old, and so on. It's all described in documents. We immediately after that, after 1847, the Governor-General was asked to write to the minister in London saying there will no longer be a British immigration policy, there will be a Canadian immigration policy. And the first law passed by democracy in Canada was an Immigration Act, which is very short and very precise, and it's all about protecting immigrants by heavily fining any shipping company which brings immigrants under false and unfair circumstances. And then in 1905, and it's a really important moment, Wilfrid Laurier goes to Edmonton for the celebration of Alberta becoming part of Canada. And in the middle of his speech, it's actually the last part of his speech, he sort of raises his voice, I don't know how they did it, over the elites in the front row, and addresses himself to the Ukrainians and the Jews and the Icelanders and the, whoever, the Poles, etc., who are the thousands behind the elites. And he says the following, and I've slightly edited out some of the 19th century stuff, but this is what he says. We must also have the cooperation of the new citizens who came to Canada from all parts of the world to give to Canada, listen to this, to give to Canada the benefits of their individuality. Yeah, it's that whole idea of complexity is there. Their energy and their enterprise. Canada is, in one respect, like the kingdom of heaven. Those who come at the 11th hour will receive the same treatment as those who have been in the field for a long time. We want to share with them our lands, our laws, our civilization. Let them take their share in the life of this country, whether it be municipal, provincial, or national. Let them be electors as well as citizens. Does this sound colonial to you? No. Does this sound like we invented citizenship in 1947 or multiculturalism in the 1970s? This is 1905. Let them be electors as well as citizens. We do not want nor wish. Now this is, what is multiculturalism? We do not want or wish that any individual should forget the land of his origin. Let them look to the past, but let them still more look to the future. Let them look to the land of their ancestors, but let them look also to the land of their children. Let them become Canadians and give their heart, their song, their energy, and all their power to Canada. Now, part of that is kind of rhetoric, happy rhetoric, because he invented that whole idea of governing through a sort of, glorious discourse that would bring people together. But in there, you could take most of that and put it on an advertisement today, and it would work just as well. And you have to use stuff like that in order to understand that what we're doing, we've been doing for a long time. When we fail by our own standards. But we have had these ideas, these philosophical ideas, for a long time. The government support idea. When we, the whole idea of what we call private sponsorship and government sponsorship of the Syrian refugees, and everybody will say, well, of course, the private sponsorship idea was born with the Vietnamese boat people, right? This is absolutely true. But what's completely missing there is that Vietnamese boat people idea was simply chapter 22 in the Canadian constant reinvention of how will volunteers support immigrants to Canada. Often it was within ethnic communities, that people were supported. So that was the kind of 80s version, and now we have the 2015 version. But we've been doing it in different versions for centuries. And by the way, another linguistic correction. I really would encourage you to do whatever you can to get the name changed from private sponsorship, which suggests it's about money, whereas we know it's actually about citizen commitment. The money is really secondary. It has to be done, but it's not a big deal for most people. It's groups of people get together. It should be called citizen sponsorship, not private sponsorship, because that's what it is. So when you start talking about it all in this way, you realize that the multiculturalism of the 1970s is itself chapter 22 or 32 of a very long, flawed, but interesting history of complexity in Canadian immigration and citizenship policy. And that idea that came from Indigenous people of the multiplicity and complexity of identity and belonging, which was taken on by the Scots and by the French Canadians and all the immigrants as they came in, we're still always working at how do we deal with complexity? What does complexity look like? And our problem is, of course, that this is not the discourse used in these other countries. But once you know your own history, you understand that complexity has always been a positive thing in Canada, that tension, that mythological tension is not a bad thing. There's such a thing as positive tension. That's one of the most creative forces in Canada, is positive tension. What's so fascinating today is that when you read Indigenous leaders and Indigenous intellectuals today, they have a great sense of history, of all the wrong that was done, but also of the centrality of their own role in the creation of this model. And they explain endlessly the idea of spatiality, the idea of the circle, the idea of the complexity, the idea of multiple loyalties, that citizens are loyal. It's governments that have to be judged. We're the source of loyalty. They don't get to tell us whether we're loyal or not. We get to tell them whether they're loyal or not. That's the nature of loyalty in a democracy like ours. And once you start thinking that way, you realize that that third element in the philosophy of Canadian immigration and citizenship, volunteerism, engaged citizenship, is incredibly important. That our immigration and citizenship policies would collapse without volunteers. It's not about charity. It's about citizen engagement. The whole thing. Yesterday, the minister talked about the settlement agencies and the need to get more citizens involved in order to help the government-sponsored refugees. Of course, because the whole history of Canada is that immigration works to the extent that citizens are engaged through volunteerism in helping them find their place. And we need to get that. We already supposedly have the highest volunteerism level in the world. I think like 45%, depending on how you do the numbers. We need to get that number a lot higher. Some of the provinces have programs where kids can't graduate from high school without doing volunteerism, which they seem to really love. It's apparently a lot more fun than math, We need to get that across the country. We need to really push that to much, much higher levels and be clear in our own minds that this is not about taking away jobs from professional public servants. This is not about charity. This is not about paternalism or maternalism. This is about engaged citizenship. This is 500 years of Canadian history, that citizens have an obligation to help newcomers in whatever way there is. I just remember a couple of, 15 years ago, there was a heat wave in Europe. 70,000 people died. It was over a month in the summer. I think it was 14,000 people died of heat prostration in France. The reason they died was they don't have that idea of volunteerism. They didn't have the idea that you should go and check on your neighbor. You pay taxes, some public servant was going to go and check on your neighbor, and it was August, and the result was a lot of old people died. A couple of years later, we had the ice storm, and you die faster of cold than of heat, and not one person died. Not one person died. And the reason is, not because we're nicer, not because we're smarter, not because we're better, but because we have a philosophy of citizenship at its best, which is about volunteerism and empathy, which has nothing to do with paying taxes. It has nothing to do with public servants. It has to do with the obligation of citizens to think about other citizens. To the extent that we do that, we're doing our job. To the extent that we don't do that, we're failing by our own standards. And, that is a very central part of volunteerism. So let me just finish by saying there are enormous weaknesses in all of this. I have I'm two personalities. One is to give you this historic thing, which sounds quite positive, but I could equally turn around and spend an hour on everything that doesn't work and critique it. And one of them, most important ones, everybody knows, Pakistani engineers driving taxis, to summarize the problem, or doctors as minor cleanup assistants in hospitals. We have a major problem in Canada left over from the 19th century, the negative side of history, which is that we adopted the British European form of self-regulation for the professions, the guild system, the kind of modern professional leftover of the Middle Ages. And so we have medical associations, we have legal associations, we have engineering associations, and they run themselves. And frankly, they run themselves. Some things they do is fine, but to a great extent, they run themselves as a protectionist operation to keep people out, to keep their own salaries up. And I think that one of the most important things that you can do as a group, and one of the most important things we must demand that provincial and federal governments do, is to break these protectionist guilds. Governments must intervene. The Germans are getting ahead of us, by the way. I mean, having said what I said about Germans are getting way ahead of us. They're sending people from their universities in an organized group out to places like India to negotiate with the Indian universities, first of all, to find out what's happening, to find out what the equivalences are, and to find out what, if there needs to be remedial education, what that would be. So they're putting in place a way in which to help professionals be treated with dignity when they come to Germany. So, I mean, they're doing, I'll tell you, the Europeans are doing a lot of really great stuff, apart from their failure at the macro level, which fails also to some extent at the micro level, in some countries more than others. But they're really picking out things like the German unions are really starting to get themselves involved in hiring of new people. They're getting ahead of us, and I really admire them for that, but I don't admire us for allowing these guilds to humiliate immigrants and new citizens in Canada. And this is really easy to fix. It's really just a question of, the Universities Presidents Association saying, getting the medical schools to put together a team that says, okay, let's take the 5 best universities in India and the best in Pakistan and Sri Lanka, whatever. And we send them out there and we negotiate, and they come here and we work out what exactly, which degrees will we accept as equivalent, which degrees do we think need certain remedial work. We define that work. It is absolutely clear that when you immigrate to Canada, you know what lies ahead. You might even be able to do part of it before you come. And that the universities themselves have put in place clear programs to help these people as fast as possible get into the job of being doctors or engineers or whatever. So there is no excuse for this. It's like the absence of northern universities. This is the laziness of the old colonial family compact mentality. So here we are. We are now, as the minister said, and I agree, we're basically alone out there. We're on the cutting edge, which is also a precipice. We need a toughness in our language. We need clarity in order to be helpful in our programs. We have an enormous obligation as citizens, if you're a citizen, to make sure that this invitation to Canada is a real invitation with real support. Not just you're going to be a citizen within 5 years, but there are many, many ways in which we can give that support. Governmental and volunteer-based support and structural support. We have this gigantic obligation. We have to focus on the metaphysics of how we imagine ourselves and then the carry-through of how we imagine ourselves. And that, you were very kind to talk about 6 degrees citizen space, and I hope some of you will come. It's the 4th week of September next year. That was our idea, was to create a place where there would be an international discussion in Canada, in Toronto, 6 million people, a big city, 52% born outside of Canada, no other city like that. London and Paris are down in the 30%, right? To have a different kind of discussion, a discussion in a safe place, if you like. And indeed, the people who came from 28 different countries wrote to us almost immediately in a way I've never seen to say that they had never been involved in a conversation like that. Not because we're smarter or nicer or better, but because the whole atmosphere of the discussion was that we had normalized complexity. And they didn't feel under attack. They didn't feel that they were the minority argument trying to fight their way back against the migrant argument. And we're going to do pop-up versions of 6 degrees in Europe and in different parts of Canada. So I would say to you in closing, one, apart from the things I've already suggested, do beware of the security lens, which is taken over in so many countries. I promise you, there's big money in security. You want a job, you got a PhD today, they're snapping them up. It's the only place where job growth is really phenomenal throughout the Western world, including Canada. They're building themselves big buildings with wonderful machinery to listen to you. And the security lens is, of course we need security, but the security lens is the opponent of 500 years of intentionality in Canada when it comes to immigration and citizenship. The security lens, it has a job to do at a certain level. There were security people. You know, we were able, because we have a system to send 500-600 people to Amman, etc., to organize to bring the first 25,000 Syrians. That was part of, that we were able to do that. European countries wouldn't have been able to do that because they don't have those people. And of course there were security people in there. And of course they have a job to do. The question is, are they in charge or are they fulfilling their job at a tertiary level, which is what they need to be doing. So beware of the security lens, but I think just keep clear in your own mind that whatever its flaws, which we must always be open about, to this day, there is an intentionality in this project of immigration and citizenship. It's got 500 years of history, which is the same age as the Reformation. And it leads to a different model. You can always find the similarities, but a different model, which is a model underneath it all, which is not the Westphalian monolithic model of belonging, but a very complex spatial model of belonging. And that, curious enough, when we have confidence in ourselves, it seems to work. What we're missing is that taking that tough, muscular responsibility to explain ourselves out loud to ourselves. We don't have to be in agreement, to ourselves. And if we can explain what we're doing to ourselves, we'll be able to explain it to people in other countries, and they will be interested. Thank you very much. Merci. Thank you. Sure. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Great. I'm going to remember when I go home the long line, just the long line. Great idea. How do you see the temporary foreign worker, now I'm going to use the programmatic language, the temporary foreign worker program. I don't know what its long line is, or how you see that within that long line, because it certainly seems contrary to the kind of the core value.
So absolutely the right question. In other words, we still have many flaws. So I think the temporary worker program has two parts to it. One part is justifiable, which is there is a tradition in certain industries, mainly agricultural, it should be, in fact, almost entirely agricultural, and certain places in largely the Caribbean or Latin America, that people come for a short period of time, a month to 6 weeks, and go home. And we've improved, as I understand it, slightly the protections, probably not enough, that come with that. And it's a way for people to actually make money and go home to their families. And we should not expect people who don't want to immigrate to Canada not to immigrate to Canada. So there's a whole tradition of that. It's very precise. Any cheating on that, which is the second part, by trying to expand it into meatpacking plants or the tar sands, that is a betrayal of the idea of immigration. A total betrayal. It's anti-union, it's anti-citizen, it's anti-Canadian in the long line view. And and it got out of control, as we know, completely out of control. It's been fought back to some extent. I'm not an expert. Somebody here could probably draw how much more it could be pushed back. So it's just applying to people who very precisely are coming at a certain season to do a certain job and then going home with the money. Not necessarily with sufficient protections while they're here. So I think there's two parts to it, and we need to, again, it's about clarity. That might be okay if it's done with the proper protections. All the rest of that, which probably represents over half of it, or even 2/3 of it, is totally unacceptable. And corporations should not be able to avoid the theory and reality of the idea of Canadian citizenship by using this temporary worker program. Thank you. Anyone else?
It was absolutely amazing. Thanks very much. I appreciated what you said about the word migrant. And I agree that naming is really very important because it's about representation, it's about how people see each other and stuff like that. But within the sector, I also find the word immigrant somewhat problematic because words like immigrant and newcomer, sometimes it's kind of the process and the steps are too many to move from that to even, the fullness of citizenship that everybody should really have. So it's a difficult situation. We have to name, and then what is the right way within the history and stuff, that what word would be appropriate. It's hard to.
Well, see, this is where I talk about being muscular in our language. We must not allow ourselves to feel that there is something wrong with the concept of being an immigrant. I mean, I remember a couple of years in Vancouver, a couple of sort of senior university people saying to me, you use the word immigrant a lot, and isn't that sort of insulting to people? And I said, I'm terribly sorry, my mother was an immigrant. Are you insulting my mother? I mean, we have to be very muscular about this. Immigrant is a noble term in the Canadian vocabulary. We have to be able to say that to each other and say that to foreign, people in other countries, that we consider the act of immigration a great and noble act which automatically leads to citizenship very quickly for most people in Canada. When you get you get the language right, then it takes on its full meaning of nobility. And I often say when I'm doing citizenship ceremonies, look, we have to yes, we're the inviter, but we have to really show admiration for the people who are coming, because what have they done? Whether they're refugees or coming for other reasons, it takes enormous courage to decide to change your country. This is not easy. Even if your country's in civil war, it is not easy to leave your own country. It needs courage. It needs a level of consciousness, of an analysis, which most of us who were born here have never had to use. And it needs a level of ability to act, decisiveness, which many of us have never, if we're middle class, have never had to prove. So, I mean, courage, consciousness, the ability to act, there are three of the most important characteristics sought in a citizen. And immigrants to Canada have already proved that they have those three characteristics, which I didn't have to prove. I didn't have to show that. I just got it, right? So we have to be much clearer about why immigration is a noble word, a noble term. And that's why I insist on, these key nouns and verbs tell us everything about ourselves, and they furnish our discussion with ourselves and with our neighbors. And if we get it right, it's the right word. If we get it wrong, we get caught in all the complexity, negative complexities surrounding migration. Anyone else? Yes, I think there was a gentleman here.
Hi. A few years ago, Will Kimlicka did a comparative study around multiculturalism policies comparing Canada and Europe. And it showed that though Europe has said that they've implemented these policies, they weren't robust, they were very shallow compared to Canada. Now that you've given us this sense, at least me, this sense that this is an entrenched part of our philosophy, our history, what, in your opinion, what has allowed us to maintain that for our entire history? And what is the vulnerability with this sort of change in philosophy, this almost more overt sort of anti-immigrant, anti-multiculturalism policies in Europe? Are we vulnerable to that moving on?
No, I mean, that's my point. I think we're totally vulnerable to it. Because, of course, we are many things at the same time. We're very complex inside. This is what it's a sort of a joke. I say Canada is a multiple personality order. I mean, so that's fine. But that is very complicated to explain to people outside who are obsessed with the idea that loyalty is tied to this monolithic concept. And the truth is that in the last 50 years, there has been a gradual return of the worst of the 19th century into the United States and into Europe. And I see my friends in Europe using language which they don't even hear themselves saying, which is in fact 17th century and even 16th century language, and certainly 19th century language, about the nature of loyalty and belonging. And that's why we have to be so clear to say, well, you could talk about migrants, but we have this great and noble concept of immigration, which is inextricably linked to citizenship. And that's why I think things like my kind of not joke about getting engaged and getting married are important, because they can understand what you're talking about when you say that. So I think it is in danger, and that's why we have to be really on top of our language, our history, our arguments, in order to not say, hey, we're great, or we're better, or you guys are horrible, but in order to be able to show that we've been going down a road, it's a flawed, their road's flawed, our road is flawed. We've made a lot of mistakes. It's a very mixed road. But we're going down this road, and it has a purpose, and it has a means, and it has a way. And I frankly, I started writing about the return of populism I think in Voltaire's Bastards in the early 90s. Unfortunately, I'm not surprised. I watched Donald Trump in the early debates, Republican debates, and I remember I would, when my wife when Adrian would go to bed, I'd go upstairs and watch like a sort of, it's almost like pornography, watching Donald Trump in those debates. And I would, and I would go and watch them. And after watching a couple of them, I'd come down, wake her up, and I said, I think this guy could win, because he's doing, he's a perfect Mussolinian. I mean, Mussolini, I did the unconscious civilization around Mussolini. And, the nature of what Mussolini did is very precise. And what Donald Trump does is very close to Mussolini, except Mussolini was in better physical shape, it has to be said, and shaved his head. But apart from that, So I think this is a really dangerous time. And that's why that's why I keep saying, beware of the security agenda. Beware of the word migrant. Get your mind in order about, volunteerism, about citizenship, about complexity, about multiple personality, about the purpose of immigration is loyalty, about the nobility of immigration, about critiquing our own system on the basis of where we fail against our own standards. And we have to be really tough on ourselves, because if we're not, we'll just end up saying, well, we're the best country in the world, or stuff like that, which is so embarrassing and so boring and so silly. And so wrong, So I don't know if that answers your...
Thank you very much. I think we will close here.
All right, we didn't make it to 5.
We didn't make it to
Sorry
5.
about that. My fault.
So
Thank
please
you very
join
much.
me in
Thank you.
thanking